First Year, Part 2. The summer wind blew softly, and the sunshine was bright where it shone through the east windows that first morning. It was an early sun, but breakfast was even earlier, for Manly must not be late at Webb's for the threshing. All the neighbors would be there, since they would expect Mr. Webb to give them a good day's work in exchange as their turns with the threshers came. No one could afford to be late and hold up the gang at Webb's place, so the first breakfast in the new home was a hurried affair. Then Manly drove away with the brown horses hitched to the lumber wagon, and Laura was alone for the day. It would be a busy day. There was so much to do putting the little new house in order. Before beginning, Laura looked the place over with all the pride of possession. The front door in the northeast corner of the room opened onto the horseshoe-shaped drive before the house. Just south of it was the east window where the morning sun shone in. In the center of the south wall was another bright window. The drop-leaf table stood against the west wall with one leaf raised and a chair at either end. It was covered with moss, bright red and white checked tablecloth on which stood the remains of the early breakfast. A door at the end of the table led into the storm shed, and there was Almanzo's cook stove with pots and frying pans on the walls. Then there was a window and a back door that opened toward the south. Just across the corner from the door into the shed was the pantry door, and such a pantry! Laura was so delighted with the pantry that she stood in the doorway for several minutes admiring it. It was narrow, of course, but long. Opposite her at the far end was a full-size window, and just outside the window stood a young cottonwood tree, its small green leaves fluttering in the morning wind. Inside, before the window, was a broad work shelf, just the right height at which to stand. On the wall at the right, a strip of board ran the whole length of it, and in it was driven nails on which to hang dishpans, dish towels, colanders, and other kitchen utensils. But the wall to the left was all a beautiful cabinet. Manly had found a carpenter of the old days who, though old and slow, did beautiful work, and the pantry had been his pride and labor of love to Manly. The wall was shelved the whole length. The top shelf was only a short space from the ceiling, and from it down, spaces between the shelves were wider until there was room for tall pitchers and other dishes to stand on the lower shelf. Beneath the lowest shelf was a row of drawers as well made and fitted as boughten furniture. There was a large wide drawer for holding a baking of bread. There was one drawer that already held a whole sack of white flour, a small one with graham flour, another with cornmeal, a large shallow one for packages, and two others, one already filled with white sugar and the other with brown, and one for Manly's wedding present of silver knives and forks and spoons. Laura was so proud of them. Underneath the drawers was an open space to the floor, and here stood the stone cookie jar, the donut jar, and the jar of lard. Here also stood the stone churn and dasher. The churn looked rather large when the only cow giving milk was the small fawn-colored heifer Pa had given them as a wedding present, but there would be more cream later when Manly's cow should be fresh. In the center of the pantry, a trapdoor opened into the cellar. The door into the bedroom was just across the corner from the front door. On the wall at the foot of the bed was a high shelf for hats. A curtain hung from the edge to the floor, and on the wall behind it were hooks for hanging clothes, and there was a carpet on the floor. The pine floors of the front room and pantry were painted a bright, clean yellow. The walls of all the house were white plaster, and the pine woodwork was satin smooth and oiled and varnished its natural color. It was a bright and shining little house, and it was really all theirs, Laura thought. It belonged to just Manly and her. The house had been built on the tree claim, looking forward to the time when the small switch trees would be grown. Already Manly and Laura seemed to see it sitting in a beautiful grove of cottonwoods and elms and maples which were already planted along beside the road. The hopeful little trees stood in a half circle of the drive before the house. They were hovering close on each side and at the back. Oh, surely, if they were tended well, it would not be long before they sheltered and protected the little house from the summer's heat and the winter's cold and the winds that were always blowing. But Laura could not stand idly in the pantry dreaming and watching the cottonwood leaves blowing. There was work to be done. She cleared the breakfast table quickly. It was only a step from it to the pantry where everything was arranged on the shelves as it belonged. The dirty dishes she piled in the dishpan on the work shelf before the window. The tea kettle of hot water on the stove was handy, too, and soon everything was clean and the door closed upon a pantry in perfect order. Next, Laura polished the stove with a flannel cloth, swept the floor, dropped the table leaf, and spread a clean, bright red tablecloth over it. The cloth had a beautiful border and made the table an ornament fit for anyone's front room. In the corner between the window to the east and the window to the south was a small stand table with an easy armchair at one side and a small rocker at the other. Above it, suspended from the ceiling, was a glass lamp with glittering pendants. That was the parlor part of the room. When the copies of Scott's and Tennyson's poems were on the stand, it would be complete. She would have some geraniums growing in cans on the windows soon, and it would be simply beautiful. But the windows must be washed. They were spattered with plaster and paint from the house building, and how Laura did hate to wash windows. Just then there was a rap at the screen door, and Hattie, the hired girl from the farm adjoining, was there. Manley had stopped as he drove to the threshing and asked that she come and wash the windows when she could be spared. So Hattie washed the windows while Laura tidied the little bedroom and unpacked her trunk. Her hat was already on the shelf and the wedding dress hanging on its hook behind the curtain. There were only a few dresses to hang, the fawn-colored silk with the black stripes and the brown poplin she had made. They had been worn many times but were still nice. There was the pink lawn with the blue flowers. It would not be warm enough to wear that more than once or twice again this summer. Then there was the gray calico work dress to change with the blue she was wearing. And last winter's coat looked very good hanging on the hook beside Manley's overcoat. It would do for the winter that was coming. She didn't want to be an expense to Manley right at the beginning. She wanted to help him prove that farming was as good as any other business. This was such a lovely little home, so much better than living on a town street. Oh, she did hope Manley was right, and she smiled as she repeated to herself, "Everything is evened up in this world." Manley was late home, for threshers worked as long as there was daylight to see by. Supper was on the table when he came in from doing the chores, and as they ate, he told Laura the threshers would come the next day, would be there at noon for dinner. It would be the first dinner in the new home, and she must cook it for the threshers. To encourage her, Manley said, "You'll get along all right, and you could never learn younger." Now Laura had always been a pioneer girl rather than a farmer's daughter, always moving on to new places before the fields grew large. So a gang of men as large as a threshing crew to feed by herself was rather dismaying. But she was going to be a farmer's wife, and that was all in the day's work. So early next morning she began to plan and prepare the dinner. She had brought a baking of bread from home, and with some hot cornbread there would be plenty. Pork and potatoes were on hand, and she had put some navy beans to soak the night before. There was a pie plant in the garden. She must make a couple of pies. The morning flew too quickly, but when the men came in at noon from the thresher, dinner was on the table. The table was in the center of the room with both leaves raised to make room, but even then some of the men must wait for second table. They were all very hungry, but there was plenty of food, though something seemed to be wrong with the beans. Lacking her mother's watchful eye, Laura had not cooked them enough, and they were hard. And when it came to the pie, Mr. Perry, a neighbor of Laura's parents, tasted his first. Then he lifted the top crust and, reaching for the sugar bowl, spread sugar thickly over his piece of pie. "That is the way I like it," he said. "If there's no sugar in the pie, then every fellow can sweeten his own as much as he likes without hurting the cook's feelings." Mr. Perry had made the meal a jolly one. He told tales of when he was a boy in Pennsylvania. His mother, he said, used to take 5 beans and a kettle of water to make bean soup. The kettle was so large that after they'd eaten all the bean broth and bread they had to take off their coats and dive for a bean if they wanted one. Everyone laughed and talked, and it was very friendly. But Laura felt mortified about her beans and her pie without any sugar in. She had been so hurried when she made the pies. But how could she have been so careless? Pie plant was so sour. That first taste must have been simply terrible.